My favorite part of this podcast every week is our theory segment, Matt. And you wrote an article this week that covers a new feature at 444, and I think it translates very well to theory because we talk a lot about regression, and it has very direct impact on how we make our decisions in DFS. That is our wide receiver breakout model. John Paulson and our resident data scientist Kevin Zatluko have been working on this thing for almost 2 years, really. There's a couple other air yards type of models out there. Josh Hermsmeyer actually wrote for 444 and helped us out with some of our initial air yards work here. And this is just our interpretation of using air yards, using wide receiver usage to pinpoint what we're calling breakout players for DFS purposes. We'll call them DFS targets. But before we get into it, since this is our theory segment, let's get into the theory of finding breakout wide receivers on a weekly level, and just talk us through, before we get into the specifics, what is this model? What is modeling in general when it comes to this fantasy stuff?
Yeah, I feel like you hear it more and more often that someone created a model, and what exactly that means can, certainly on sports Twitter, it can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about this particular model, this is using a large data set of historical data to try and predict the future. At its simplest terms, that's all we're doing here. And there's an old saying about models that all models are wrong, some are useful. Meaning that you can never contextualize a model at all the features, at all the things that you want that a human knows how to do. So we're always contextualizing the information from this model. But what it can help us do is use history as a guide to show us where in the future there's in the present, there's an incongruency between a player's usage or their opportunity and their production.
Yeah.
And when we identify those players, we often find situations where that naturally corrects itself in the upcoming weeks. So hence the receiver breakout model. And I do want to mention here that my role in this was towards the very end. You mentioned Kevin and John. They've put so much time into this. And just like you would see in the corporate world where a data scientist puts a model into training before it is put, as they say, into production, as it was put for this week. We studied this model. We created at the end of 2019, which meant we spent a whole season studying this, making sure that it was well calibrated. And now it's handed off to me, essentially the data analyst. And so my job in this process is to package those models' results into a consumable and understandable presentation for the target audience, which is, in our case, the readers and the listeners here. So that's why you see charts and graphs that can help you usually. Sometimes they get really complicated and they can actually hinder your understanding of a model. And you'll see a graph that I made at the top of this model this week. And please, if you have some feedback about how it could be more helpful or how you're not understanding it, please hit us up. I'm at Draftaholic or at 4for4 Football. And I don't want to spend too much time here, TJ. But I know that there's probably a small part of the audience that's interested in the really data science heavy aspect of this.
Yeah, we have a smart crowd. I think they won't mind it too much.
Okay, so I actually don't have a lot of the specifics related to things like feature engineering, like was there a clustering algorithm or any sort of unsupervised machine learning done beforehand, or the algorithm specifically used. But we do know that it was validated against a year of real data. And so what we have used a specific error metric, so we don't have anything like an adjusted R squared or an out of sample R squared, which is something that an error metric that you typically see used. But what we do have is that of the underperforming cohort, the people that are underperforming expectation, again, that's the group we're finding breakouts from. On average, they score 90% of their expected fantasy points the following week.
That's a huge point right there.
That's a really solid amount. And obviously there's going to be some variance there. Some people score way over their expected amount. Some people score way under their expected amount. And it ultimately washes out in the fact that all almost collectively get to that expected value. That's a really strong sign of a well-calibrated model. So it's a long-winded way of saying that we've got a lot of data going into a really strong breakout model. And don't forget about the tight ends. They have a specific algorithm for the tight ends as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important. This is something that we're going to feature very heavily in this podcast, although we're kind of more focused on like just the overall values here. But in our articles a lot, and I think anybody that's already a 4for4 subscriber should definitely make it a point to be seeking this out, even though we'll be linking to it a ton. We do break up the website by redraft, DFS, or call it seasonal on the site, seasonal DFS and betting. So I think a lot of people that might be playing a lot of DFS or focusing on betting a lot might kind of overlook some of the stuff that might be under the seasonal tab. That's where this will live. But it is very important. And I'm going to continue to encourage everybody to be looking at this model. But you kind of talked about just like what it uses from a statistical and modeling standpoint, as far as just like fantasy and football metrics, stats data. What are we looking at here? Like either league level or player level data?
Yeah, so it definitely uses both. That's really important here because we want to make sure that we have an understanding of both on a league level, what is supposed to happen here, all things being equal. But then on a player level, do we have a history of this player performing under or below expectation? Because what we found is that especially the past 10 weeks of player efficiency is highly indicative of how well they used that recent opportunity. And so it's really helped us get a stronger model here. And so I'll just dig into it here. The model heavily weights two distinct time periods and tries to combine that together. I already mentioned the past 10 weeks. It uses the opportunity and creates an expected fantasy points model during that time, and efficiency, which is a roll-up of multiple efficiency metrics that use both air yards data, as you mentioned, TJ, and routes run data from our data provider as well. And so that efficiency metrics, there is a little proprietary blend in there, but you can imagine what they are like, similar to yards per route run or targets per route run. So that's how we're creating an opportunity and efficiency metrics here. But then we also look at the past 3 weeks. We found that to be the most important period of time. And that's why we're debuting it in week 4, because now we have 3 weeks of in-season data to really get a feel for the possible changes that have occurred from that 10-week window to the 3-week window. And what we found is that even if we just have those 3 weeks, like for rookies or players that were injured, we can make a worthwhile prediction, an expected fantasy points prediction for those players. So the article just goes through the players who are currently underperforming their prediction and highlights players that we think have a chance of breaking out this specific week.
Yeah, early in the season, that just kind of reminded me when you were laying out how we're going to be using it and the time frame we're going to be using it. Early in the season, during our preseason episodes, when we were talking about prepping for the season, one of the things we talked about was how much data we consume and how we have to be careful not to double count things and get too lost in numbers. Kind of like a not point per dollar, but like our proprietary value metric for DFS takes all of the information that is captured in projections, compares it to not to just to salary, but to position scarcity, to other players at other positions. It gives us a really quick value metric. This kind of takes away all of our worries with pass catchers for having to double count, right? Like we're getting all of this information that we need, finding out how much they should be scoring, finding out who's good at meeting that expectation, and then finding out who's good and who hasn't been and is going to continue to do it. So you don't have to worry about double counting with this. This is doing all of the counting for you. So it's just like you said, I mean, I can't even express. I've been watching John and Kevin work on this, and luckily I haven't. This is one of the projects I haven't had my hands on. But as you mentioned, they've been back testing it, make sure it works well. That's why it wasn't released last year, because we wanted to make sure it was good. So all of that is just to tell you that every week we're going to give you a chart with these names and say these players are supposed to play good. So how are we going to use that chart?
Yeah, so that's the real thing we want to know, right?
Yeah.
How do we use this?
Give us the
new
answers.
Tool? Right. I wish I could. I wish I could. So, as I mentioned before, the article is going to be highlighting players who over the last 3 weeks are averaging less than their expected fantasy points per game. And remember, it uses a last 3 weeks expected average and then just compares 3 weeks. So sometimes you will see players.
I don't mean to cut you off,
Yeah.
but we should clarify that expected fantasy points is our proprietary metric. So you might see expected fantasy points thrown about. Other sites have theirs. That's our calculated expected fantasy points.
That's correct. And when you're creating a model like this, that is still by far the best metric to use to optimize and to compare the differential. So actually, the column that you see that is honestly the most important is that difference column. Yep. You're going to see some players who are a little bit closer to their expectation than others. And one thing that you cannot do is expect that players who have a further distance from their expected value to have a larger, what they call rubber band effect. There's no evidence that occurs. And another thing you need to pay attention to is multiple pass catchers on the same team showing up on this list, because that often means the quarterback is the one responsible, or at least partially responsible, for those players showing up on that list. Because you'll often see, I'll tell you, the Jets right now are on that list. The whole team will end up below expectation because compared to a league average level, which the model is optimizing for, they're performing under expectation. The value of opportunity on the Jets is less than the average value of the same opportunity on another team. That makes sense. Now, speaking of making this all make sense, the most important part is to contextualize the model's results with John Paulson's award-winning 4-for-4 projections, because, again, the human touch is something that we are valuing very highly here. It's not something that we want to just take away here. The robots are not coming for our jobs in this case.
Not yet.
These projections that John creates are generated in a much more hands-on way. And truly, the blend of this model and those projections is really the best we can do right now in predicting and projecting future performances. So the last thing I'll say is the model cannot account for all changes in personnel, schemes, situation, and it can't tell the difference between what is bad luck and what is poor play. That's for you to decide.
And that's for us to decide, right? That's why you're writing the article. You're going to go in and, like you said, you're going to contextualize some of these numbers, and we're not just going to blindly look at the biggest difference or the biggest expected fantasy points. We're going to hopefully be able to guide you in the right direction. So I think the savvy listener, anybody that's played quite a bit, probably has a good idea where we're going with this. But if you're just jumping in, if you're fast forwarding, if you're washing dishes and not paying attention, how can you apply all of these things to DFS?
So now the last thing is that we're just finding low roster players, again, whose production is incongruent with their opportunity. And that's really all we're finding. And then we add in a little bit of past efficiency, again, then past 10 weeks efficiency, and we get a little bit closer to finding who really should be a breakout player. And one last step, and I'll actually tell you when we get to this list, if you filter out players who scored over their expected value just last week, you often find a list of just maybe 8 or 9 players who really fit all the descriptions here.
Yeah, I will. Before I don't want to forget this. Before we move on to the next part, this article is free on 4for4 this week, and I believe that it will stay free. The week 4 article will stay free forever. But obviously, for this week's application, go in there, check it out, use it. Week 5 and moving forward will be subscriber only. But if you're listening to this late, you can still go to the week 4 article and just get an idea of what it looks like and what we're offering in this article. But you mentioned that the application of DFS, and the overwhelming number of the time that we're going to use this is going to find low-owned, usually tournament players. I do think there are some cash game applications. Oftentimes we're just going to see some of the higher end receivers on this because they're the highest used wide receivers, right? They're the highest used tight ends. So when they have a couple bad weeks, they're the ones that are going to be popping on this. So as long as their expected points are staying high, there's going to be spots where people are like, can I use this $7,000 receiver in cash? He hasn't scored 10 points in 3 weeks. I think we can use this and say he's still a viable cash play. And then on the other end of the spectrum, especially on DraftKings, where we're doing a lot of stars and scrubs builds, if you're going to just punt a pass catcher, a tight end or a receiver, why not have one of these guys that are in the model? So again, usually going to be using this for tournaments, but I do think there are some cash game applications. We don't usually give more picks on this podcast, but since we're talking about this, since we're making it free this week, you don't have to dive into each player. You can give a quick list. If there's anybody you want to make some points on, you can. Who are people that are popping in this model going in now that we have the 3 weeks of data that the rolling count is going to be 3 weeks for the rest of the season. So who's on that initial list?
Yeah. We'll give out the initial list for free as a little teaser for what you'll get every week. Yeah. But these are all the players who the model predicts are underperforming their current opportunity levels, and that their expected fantasy points for wide receivers is 10 points, half PPR or higher, or for tight ends, 8.5 points or higher. So and all these players had a week 3 that they did not outperform their current expected fantasy points, because those players that did outperform, they may not have gone way over in certain cases, but their ownership level is going to be much different because they showed already that they can reach expectations. So here's the list.
AKA Manny Sanders.
AKA Manny Sanders. He's still on the list, but he had a 2-touchdown game last week. He's not exactly someone we don't know about anymore. Yeah. But here's another build to start it off. Stephon Diggs is still underperforming expectation. That ceiling game is coming for him. I'm just going to rattle off the list real quick here. Michael Pittman, Devontae Parker, Devonta Smith, Courtland Sutton, Sammy Watkins, Calvin Ridley. Please show us something, Falcons offense. Kenny Golladay, and then 2 tight ends for you, Kyle Pitts and Jared Cook. I realize Cook is not on the main slate here, but...
a couple that jump off the page to me, and if you have any final thoughts, Cook's not on the main slate this week. A couple that jump out to me, Michael Pittman. I think he's just in a really good spot to be performing very well. You mentioned Diggs. I don't think people are going to be surprised that people like his scenario this week. Devonta Smith, I think he's going to be a really interesting spot against the Chiefs because I already mentioned Jalen Hurts. And then Kyle Pitts, man, I mean, I think he's just going to naturally get so – if he doesn't have another big game this week, I think he's going to continue to get so much hate. And it's our fault. As a community, we hyped him up so much. His usage is fine, but he's doing what a rookie tight end is supposed to do. I'm
sorry, TJ. He's not doing what a rookie tight end is supposed to do. He's doing more than a rookie tight end has ever done.
Yes,
and it's still not just good enough for fantasy. I mean, just comparing him to the rest of the rookie tight end cohort, historically, he's doing awesome.
But I mean, that's just going to mean we're going to win a lot of money with him in DFS all year, right?
That's right.
Any thoughts that you want to elaborate on any of these guys, or you just want to send people over to the article and make them read it?
Yeah, I'm going to make you all read it this week. Right. It's free on 4for4. Cool. And again, the biggest thing is with the table and with the charts that I'm putting in there, if you have clarification questions, if you feel like you have an idea for what would make it easier to understand, easier to read, we want you guys to understand what's going on here and make the best decisions for yourself.